I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Ronald Lee, a professor at the Graduate School in Demography and Economics at the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Lee has an MA in demography from Berkeley and a PhD in economics from Harvard, and is the founding director of the Center for the Economics and Demography of Aging at Berkeley. Throughout his career, he's taught economic demography and has earned numerous honors and awards for his contributions to this field of study. His current research focuses on the macroeconomic consequences of changing population age distributions and on intergenerational transfers and population aging. He joins us today to discuss the topics of overpopulation and demographic transition. So, Ronald, welcome, sir. It is truly an honor to be able to interview you today. So, I didn't put this in the intro, but you have such an extensive list of honors and awards, notable achievements, and organizations that you've chaired. And so, I just literally could not read all of those, but it is an honor to have you with me. Let me start out by asking how you became interested in the topic of overpopulation and demographic transition.
Well, when I was a graduate student, I got interested in the population history of Europe. And in Europe, there was this huge, tragic experiment, as it were, in the 14th century of the Black Death that killed about a third of the European population. And following that, wages rose a lot, and the rents on lands fell a lot. And so the economic consequences of population change were very visibly, were there to be seen. And that got me started on this topic. Now, the demographic transition is, well, a big story of the last couple of centuries. And you can't be interested in demography. You can't study demography without getting drawn into that topic. So it was a very natural direction for my interests then.
Okay. Okay. Well, so in terms of overpopulation, in 1968, Stanford Professor Paul Erlich prefaced his nonfiction bestseller, The Population Bomb, by saying, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now." And actually, he wrote considerably more upon that, and it was very, very dark, depressing stuff. And this was the preamble to the book. So back then, the global population was around 3.5 billion people. Now we've reached 8 billion people. We're well past his predictions. What prevented his doomsday scenario from happening?
Well, he was just dead wrong on many topics, not on all topics, but on the sort of economic consequences, he just had it wrong. And he sort of underappreciated the possibilities of technological change, of the flexibility of human responses through market signals to growing scarcity of things like copper. He missed the switch from the importance of land and physical capital to human capital, which I think we'll come to later. He was sort of overconfident, and he has a kind of bombastic personality. Now, later in the 1990s, he and his wife repeated some of these ideas, but with much more emphasis on environmental consequences and what he called natural capital. And there, I think he was right on target. But so far as the food goes, no, the food output has just risen much more rapidly than population, and per capita food consumption has increased. And I doubt that that's going to be our big problem going forward.
Well, at some point there is a limit to the Earth's carrying capacity, right? I mean, do you have any idea, even just kind of a ballpark figure about what it would hit before we start to get into these doomsday scenarios? Maybe not food, but there are so many different resources there that become scarce, droughts, water, things like that.
Yeah. Um, the thing is, it depends on two things in a major way. One is what our standard of living is as human beings. If if we choose to live at the lowest possible level of consumption, well, there were careful calculations by a biologist, demographer, Joel Cohen, in a book he published about 20 years ago. He concluded that you could have as many as 50 billion humans living on Earth at a very low standard of living. But at current standards of living and technologies and policies, I think we'd have to say the planet is already exceeding its carrying capacity. But that's a sort of static way of looking at it because we've barely scratched the possibility of serious policies to address the environmental problems. Well, in any event, so it's a complicated question to answer, but that upper limit is far from where we are, but nobody, I think, today would want to live under those conditions.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you're right. The quality of life, right? And that fluctuates and varies. It
Yeah,
it does seem like world population, these volumes again, around 8 billion people is already affecting the quality of life. Things like traffic congestion, urban sprawl, urban population density, pollution. These would all be reduced with fewer people contributing to them. Now, do you think that's overly simplistic to say, or would fewer people be better overall, I guess?
well, um, I think if we had fewer people, and we can look at places like Australia, for example, where they have a huge amount of land and not many people, what would happen is that the people would congregate in densely populated cities near some parts of the coast, and they'd have the same problems that we have in other cities. People like living in cities for the most part, and there are also advantages to that high density living, and there are economic advantages and social advantages. And so I don't think that would get away from the problems you mentioned exactly. But would it reduce pollution and environmental impact? Well, certainly it would. If we were, had a smaller population but living with the same technology and consumption levels and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I had wondered about that when I was writing the question. I thought, would there be maybe fewer cities, but they'd be just as packed? And I kind of suspected
Yeah.
that. So,
Brazil is another example of a huge country with a lot of these same problems.
well, let's get into demographic transition because I think for me, this is the really intriguing and I think counterintuitive part. It's really a
Yeah.
mind-blowing idea, but so that the trends seem to suggest that population growth will actually plateau as countries transition from high birth rates and high death rates to low birth rates and death rates. Can you tell me about this concept of demographic transition?
Yeah. Well, if we go back, say, a couple of hundred years for Europe, or more like 100 years for the rest of the world, populations were pretty much close to zero growth. Death rates were very high, life was short, and fertility was very high. Well, not astronomical, but maybe 5 or 6 births per woman on average. And that would lead to roughly constant populations or very slow growth. But then various changes happen, the agricultural revolution, globalization, marketization, and so on. And mortality begins to fall. Death rates begin to fall. Fertility remains high. So populations begin to grow, and that growth accelerates. And that happened first in Europe. So the global share of Europe's population increased during that period, say in the 19th century. But then, after a number of decades of this rapid growth, for reasons I guess we'll come to in a few minutes, then the birth rate begins to fall. And so first, population growth rates accelerate. And I should say, before the transition, populations are very young, a very high proportion of children. During this period of rapid population growth, that becomes even more true. But then as fertility begins to decline, the population growth rate slows down, and the proportion of young people in the population drops, the proportion of workers, working age people increases, there's a boost to economic growth. But then as fertility continues to decline, at some point we begin to experience population aging. Population growth rates drop towards zero, birth rates and death rates drop towards equality. Then it turns out, I mean, we used to think that would be the end of the story, but now it seems that birth rates continue to drop below death rates, so we may have population decline. So that's the demographic transition. And towards the end, then, we have, instead of having young populations, we have old populations. We have much bigger populations, but we're back again towards the zero growth or possibly even decline that we started with. So that's the story of the demographic transition.
Now, I've read that there are some other factors that also contribute to this, like increased education, increased access to birth control, things along those lines. Do you see those as major contributors, or is this a larger trend, I guess?
Well, these are the things that are behind those demographic trends. I'd say the first thing behind the decline in fertility is the earlier decline in mortality. So people who were having 6 births and wanted to end up with 2 surviving children or something like that, they didn't want to split their farm into tiny little pieces. When they realized that they didn't need to have 6 kids or 8 kids in order to have 2 surviving kids, and it became very costly for them, fertility began to decline. So that's one piece of it, but it's far from the whole story. Another piece of it is that human capital begins, given economic changes, industrialization, and so on, human capital, that is education and the health of the population, these things become more important than the physical capital of land and machines. And human capital is very costly. So if you have lots of kids, you can't educate them all so well. Or if a whole society has very high fertility, it can't invest as much in each child. And so that raises the costs of children. That's a second factor. And a third is that women who had, of course, been working very hard all along, had been working more in the home in ways that were compatible with childcare and so on. With industrialization and urbanization, the locus of women's work and men's work as well shifted from home and farm and so on into offices and factories, where you couldn't really take your kids and raise them along. And so that makes kids much more expensive in terms of foregone work time for the parents and so on. These are three of the things. Now, contraception, it plays some role, but it's not the decisive factor. The decisive factor is people wanted to have fewer kids. Contraception helped them to do that. without contraception, there was abortion, there was infanticide, there was abstinence or coitus interruptus. There were other approaches.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting. So when you mentioned having more children versus less children, do you think that this declining birth rate, do you think that this may be part of the cause of what they call helicopter parenting, right? This rise in helicopter parenting. And the reason I ask that is, so I have an only child, and she does get spoiled a little bit more than, children, larger families, I guess.
Yeah,
And those big families, right? Like the traditional American farm family where they had 4 to 6 children, they had to spread resources pretty thin.
yeah.
But in today's world where we have fewer children, do you think that's what's kind of spurring this rise in helicopter parenting where people put everything into that one child?
Absolutely, absolutely. And then getting down to one child, there are many people who feel they can't afford even one child because I think of South Korea, which is now one of the richest countries in the world. Well, their birth rate, it's now below one birth per woman. I think it's at about 0.8 or something. And people feel they cannot afford to give that even one child the education that they want, and that they think that one child will be too disruptive for their careers and so on. So, well, it's really quite remarkable, I think, these changes.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's yeah, it's truly transformative on a massive scale. And I think, again, I was taken by surprise when I first started to learn about it, and that's why it's so profound. But now, so let me ask about peak population. There are various estimates on this. The United Nations estimates, or at least at one time, they estimated a peak in the year 2100 of around 11.2 billion people. But there are others, such as Norwegian climatologist Jorgen Randers, who see the population peaking around 2040 at only, well, he had said around 8 billion people. So, what are your thoughts on this? What do you think our peak will actually be in terms of population?
okay, so the latest UN projections in 2022 are about a billion lower than the 11.2 you mentioned. They're now down to 10.4, and they do a range of high, medium, and low. That's their medium projection. Their low projection has about 8 billion and will have some a rise and then a decline because, as you said, we're already pretty much at 8 billion now and we're still growing. So I think, first of all, I don't think the differences are so great, and there's a great deal of uncertainty on all sides. But I will say that the United Nations has been doing these global population projections since the 1940s. They have a track record of 70 years or more now, and they have done very well. There have been lots of studies of comparing what they projected to what's happened and so on. They have a long track record of successful projection, uh, whereas these newer efforts, I guess Norwegian one you mentioned, IIASA in Austria, and the health metrics in Seattle, Washington, um, are newer arrivals in the game. They don't yet really have a track record. They may be right. The big question in all this is really Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. That's where most of the future population growth will occur. That's where the demographic transition has proceeded most slowly. Fertility is still 4.5 births per woman or something like that there. Otherwise, if we look at the rest of the world, 2/3 of the world's population now lives in countries where fertility is below what is called the replacement level of 2.1 births per woman. So 2/3 of the world's population lives in countries that are below the point of replacing their populations through births now. That's pretty astonishing. And there are 60 countries that are projected to have smaller populations in 2050 than they do today. That's also really remarkable. And there are many countries that already have declining populations. Sub-Saharan Africa, still growing, may double, may triple. We just don't know exactly what's going to happen. And that's the main reason, I think, why these projections are different. That said, it's also the case that there has been unexpected fertility decline just in the last few years. In the US, over the last decade, well, since 2010, since the Great Recession or so, we've just had steadily declining birth rates. We're about 25% lower than we were back in 2010. We used to have replacement level fertility. We had for decades. We were the one rich industrial country that still had quite high fertility. We had about a half kid per woman more than other rich industrial countries. All that seems to have gone away. And it's quite puzzling and mysterious, because there was no surprise that fertility dropped with the Great Recession. The surprise was it didn't recover. It just kept going down. And now we're at about 1.6 births per woman. And this really changes the outlook for the US.
Yeah, well, and so my numbers could be mistaken, but I'd read that the U.S. and Canada, the U.S. Last time I looked, was about it was under 1% population growth. I think it was about
Yeah.
0.5%, and then Canada, it looked like was around 1% population growth per year. So these are low, but again, just to reinforce what you said a moment ago, demographic transition, this is not theory, this is fact, and this is playing out in all over the world. And the more industrialized, the more technologically advanced nations seem to be suffering the most or changing the most. Maybe that's the best way to express it.
Let's say, yeah. And if we looked just at the high income countries of the world, they would already be having population decline were it not for immigration, or that would be true in the next 5 or 10 years if you look at the UN data. So immigration is definitely playing a role for the richer for the high income countries. It's an important role in sustaining their populations. For the sending countries, it's much less important because they're enormous, and these migratory streams are, relatively speaking, much smaller. But there are issues of brain drain and so on, to be sure.
Well, so again, this has a lot of side effects. The demographic transition, when the population shrinks, as you mentioned, it ages. And so this is going to affect programs like Social Security that rely upon the contributions of one generation to support the older generation.
Yeah.
It as you mentioned, it also affects immigration. I've heard that the United States and other nations have relaxed some of the immigration laws in some ways to basically help stabilize those population levels. I'm not sure how true that is, but that's something that I have read. I did want to ask if you see this shrinking and aging workforce driving advances in automation and potentially driving up wages for workers. The reason I asked that was I worked in Redmond during the dot-com boom, and at that time, I would say wages and perks and all of the things that come along with scarcity were just bestowed on anyone who could use a computer, and I'm wondering if just having a scarcity of workers, I mean, it seems like that would drive a lot of advances in automation. And as there are fewer people for those roles, it seems like compensation and benefits might go up. Do you see that potentially happening?
Yeah, I think it is, and there's international evidence that those countries with more slowly growing or declining workforces and more rapid aging also have more rapid technological progress. And I think what you say about rising wages, I also think is true. And I think it's also the case that in general, capital intensity in aging populations is going to rise. That is, there will be more capital relative to labor because old people have accumulate capital, and as the rising proportion of old people leads to increased capital at the same time that the labor force is growing more slowly or declining. Well, more capital per worker then also means that the the productivity of capital drops, interest rates, the return on capital drop, and there's been this long run trend downward in real interest rates over the last 2 or 3 decades. So we're down to zero. Probably at the moment, we may even be negative given the rates of inflation. And the ratio of wages to interest rates just go way up. So I think that is what the future is going to bring, much as you describe it. One of the big questions is how this will play out for care for the elderly and to what extent it's possible to automate that and have robotics and artificial intelligence caring for the elderly. And the Japanese are leaders in that area.
Yeah. Now, so getting a little bit more speculative, and this is something you touched on a moment ago. According to a 2008, this is a little bit old now, IIASA report, if the world stabilizes at a total fertility rate of 1.5, where Europe was at that time, then by 2200, the year 2200, the global population will fall to half of what it is today. Then they suggested by the year 2300, it'll barely scratch 1 billion. Do those numbers sound plausible? I mean, 1 billion, so that would be basically 1/8 of our current population.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we grant the premise of fertility, global fertility going to 1.5 and staying there, I'm sure they've done the arithmetic correctly. They're a very competent organization. Do I think that's likely to happen? No. I think it's more likely, I mean, things change, people's attitudes change, cultural values change, economies change, and I mean, there's nothing magic about replacement level fertility, but I just suspect that changes in policy, changes in society and in values will lead some sort of rebound in fertility. I think some of the very low fertility we see now is due to a lag in our institutions adjusting to new circumstances. And for example, producing family-friendly work environments, perhaps encouraging, facilitating, incentivizing the greater participation of men in home tasks, from childcare through household work. These kinds of things seem to make a difference internationally, and countries like Japan and Korea and China are quite desperate to raise their fertility, and I think they will find ways to do it. Financial incentives haven't turned out to be very helpful, although they've been tried by many countries in recent decades. So there's a lot of background data to analyze. But what does seem more helpful of these kinds of family-friendly policies that make work easier, that make it easier for families to shop on weekends or in the evening instead of just during Monday to Friday, 8 to 5 or something like that. Involvement of men in the household, all these kinds of things seem to be more important.
You know, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, I was going to touch on the city of Nagi in Japan, and they pay families. They have a graduated scale, so it's more money for more children, but they pay about 100,000 yen for the first child, up to around 400,000 yen for I think it's the third or fourth child.
Yeah.
You know, which in U.S. dollars, I think that comes out to about 1,400 for the fourth child. So, you know, so it does help. It's an incentive, right, for low income families. I guess that could be quite useful. But what you're talking about with basically just providing more resources, I guess, and providing more family friendly environments, it does seem like that might have more of a long-term incentive. So,
Yeah.
well, Ronald, let me thank you so much for your time today. I genuinely, it has been an honor to have you with me today. And I would love to actually have you back in the future if you're open to it. We could potentially talk about negative inflation rates. I think that's also, you'd mentioned that, and I thought,
Yeah.
you know what, that might be one to return to. So,
Yeah. That
okay.
sounds interesting.
Well, thank
Okay,
you.
and thank you. I've enjoyed this discussion, and maybe we'll revisit it.
Thank you again, sir.
Bye-bye.